I'm George Rolfe Miller. I was born in Albion, New York on September 30th of 1920.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. George Rolfe Miller to Point of Rock Studios in 90 over 90. Dr. Miller was born on September 30th, 1920, and was married to the late Judith Miller for over 60 years. Together they raised two children, Ann Pardue and Rolfe Miller. He's the proud grandparent of 5 and is the retired founding partner of Gaston Orthopedic Clinic. Dr. Miller attended Rochester University and studied or did his internship in Atlanta as well as Duke University. He spent a number of years in Warm Springs, Georgia in the late 40s at the polio clinic established by President Franklin Roosevelt. He later spent many years in the Gaston Orthopedic Hospital as a lead physician, attending to children with orthopedic needs. He and his wife are retired in Gastonia and has been involved in the community for most of his, if not all his retirement, still is. And Dr. Miller, welcome to 90 over 90. Thank you for coming. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
I mentioned that you were born, or I think you mentioned that you were born in Albion, New York. I've never been to Albion, New York. I do know from my research that it's near the Canadian border. Tell us what that little town was like back in the 20s.
Well, Albion was a small town of 5,000. It was like all small towns. We didn't have any tremendous activities. When I was born, the schools were still in the development stage. My mother became a member of the Board of Education for many years, and she was instrumental in helping build new schools so that we had an excellent high school by the time I came along. I started in a very small school, which was several blocks from our home, and then eventually graduated to a larger school, and finally they built a new school and a new high school, and I had a chance to go to that school.
Well, one of the things that struck me when we first started talking about doing this that I think is interesting is you said early on that you knew at a young age that you wanted to be a doctor.
Yes.
And we didn't talk much about it then, but tell me, what do you remember about that? Why do you say that, and what caused you to think you wanted to be a doctor at an early age?
I don't know. We had an interesting relationship with our family doctor and his wife, both of whom were physicians. They were great friends, and I don't know if they influenced me or what, but when I was about 4 years old, I just said that I was going to be a doctor, and I stuck with it.
I would say you did.
And I was lucky enough. I graduated from high school. I was not the smartest person in my class. I was number 4, headed by 3 women. Characteristic of my life, the women had been dominant. But we had a good time when I was in school. We didn't have any athletic program at that time, and we didn't have a gym, we didn't have a pool.
Well, how long did winter last in Albion? I mean, it sounds like to me...
Well, we started in winter in probably April. Wait a minute, I'm wrong. Got to go the other way, haven't I? Yeah, October. September was a nice month. October would begin to get cold, and then November would get bad. Then we would begin to get snowstorms, and it would be pretty heavy. We lived in town on the main highway, and our house was about 2 feet from the driveway, and then you went into the back of the lot, and back quite a ways going up a hill, there was a 2-car barn, and it was a barn because in the early days that was used a farm. When my grandparents first moved from their farm, they still kept animals at all at the house in town. But by my day, that there were no more animals kept there.
You still had kind of some of the outbuildings and that were used on the farm originally. Now, it was you, your sister, your mom and dad, and I think your dad early on was maybe a little bit in the farming business, the orchard business, because it was a big canning town. Is that correct?
I can describe that a little bit. In my early days, we had a family. I mean, my sister and myself, and but we lived in town, and we lived in the old part of town, and all of our friends were younger, and they came and later to a different part of town, so we didn't have any playmates in our block. Around the corner from us, there was one family, and I think in some way this may have started me in medicine. They had a daughter who she had, I don't know where she'd be classified in present day literature, but she was somewhat retarded. She had difficulty speaking, and some of the people made fun of her. And I guess I developed some feeling of passion for her, and that may have gotten me started in medicine, but at a very early age I just knew that I was destined to be a doctor. I didn't know what kind, but when I went to high school and of course got in the National Honor Society, I was toward the top of my class. I received a scholarship at the University of Rochester, which paid my tuition. And at the end of 3 years, I applied for the medical school.
Now, back then, I guess you could go to medical school without actually having an undergraduate degree if you were accepted. Is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And
if you got accepted.
Right. And you were at Rochester, which, again, I looked that up. That's pretty near Lake Ontario. Is that correct?
Yeah. Rochester's an interesting city. Of course, it was the home of Eastman Kodak. There was a lot of money there. We had one aunt who lived there, but that was about the only contact we had with people in Rochester.
Did they have a medical school there as well?
They did not in the beginning. When I was growing up, we built a new high school, and as I say, I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to the University of Rochester. And when I went there, I joined a fraternity. I joined Delta Upsilon fraternity. I really don't remember too much of my early days in college.
Sounds like you studied a lot.
I had to. I wasn't the smartest cookie in the block.
Well, you keep saying that. I'm not really buying that, but that's up to you.
But I had to work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's good to work hard. You feel like you've accomplished something.
And when I was young, I was taught to work. We had a farm which was 15 miles from our home, and that was the Rolfe family, which went back pretty far in the community. And our farm was interesting in that the house was about a quarter of a mile from the road. And
as opposed to 2 feet. As opposed to your other house, which is right on the edge of the road.
Yeah. The house sat way back, and of course there were fields there, and had a long driveway going back, and then the house sat there, and the house was interesting to me because it had a porch which was not enclosed, but it was behind. There was a porch on the front, and then at the side there was also an entrance which went into the kitchen. It was a working farm, and they had farm hands. The kitchen was very large, and it was big enough so that it had an area where you could lie down and rest. There were two the old-fashioned stoves.
Now, what was the
stoves.
crop of the farm? Let's get. I want tell me what y'all were growing there. What was your What were you?
Well, our farm was primarily fruit, and we had about 50 acres of orchards. We had apple orchard, pears, peaches, plums. I guess that's about it. And then we had a pasture in the back. We used to have, I guess it would be called Brahmins. We had
Big cow, the big bulls.
big cattle back there. Usually have about 4 or 5 of those. In the early days,
Well, it sounds like to me the reason you became a doctor is you didn't want to be a farmer.
I didn't want to be a farmer. No, I learned that in an early age.
There's a lot of work involved in that. Not that it's not
there was
working.
a lot of work involved, and but I ended up having to do a lot of work when I was in high school. I worked all the time on farms, and in the 1928, my family built a small cottage on Lake Ontario, so we spent our summers down there. But in the morning, at about 6 o'clock, we would leave our lake place and we would come up to town, and we would go to work up there
At the farm.
various places.
Well, let me ask you this.
And-
Interrupt you for a second. Your I guess during part of the year you lived up on the lake, and so you would come back to the farm and work.
Well, we lived on the lake, but my father was fortunate that he could drive us up to work in the morning,
Okay.
and he would let us out at the farmer's. The farmer had a place. There were 2 main roads that went down to the lake, and right at the corner there, just at the edge of town, was a big farm that was a fruit farm. And so we started in an early age working in the orchards there, picking for that man.
Well, do you remember? Was your operation, or do you have any distinct memory of the Depression, or when things kind of got? Did it affect your farming operation in the 30s?
Well,
before the war.
I remember the Depression because temporarily I lost my father. My father became appointed to a job with eventually with the Farm Credit Administration, and he had a job to go any place in the country for any person who wanted to borrow $100,000. If you wanted that much, you had to apply, and the loan was referred to him, and he had to go wherever it was and appraise that farm. So for a long time, he was traveling because that was part of his job.
So you didn't see him as much anymore.
I didn't see him much for a while. Eventually, he combined his work, and he and the president of the Federal Land Bank of Springfield had been classmates, and they asked my father to come and take over about 8 counties in western New York and handle the farm loaning for that area. And that got him started in that, and then eventually the other job came, which took him all over.
Well, I want to cover your medical career, and it's important for me to talk about your medical career. You may not want to talk about it, but I want to talk about your time in Warm Springs. But before we go there, fast forward to that part of your life. I know you mentioned your mom attended Vassar, which was your mother attended Vassar College
Yes.
as a young lady before you were around, and your dad, I think, had worked his way through Cornell University.
My father graduated from Cornell.
And
he taught briefly at Cornell agriculture.
So you came from a home that education was important.
After that, he decided he wanted to be more on his own, so he developed a business for a while, and then he eventually became associated with the Federal Land Bank of Springfield.
Right, but I guess my point was, it's understood, I guess, early on that you were going to attend college and get a full education.
Oh, I don't think there was any question in my family, but what both my sister went to Wheelock School in Boston, which was a school to train kindergarten teachers, and then after that she got her advanced degree from Syracuse, and I was lucky to get a scholarship at the University of Rochester, and then I managed to get into medical school, and I got an internship at the University of Rochester, and along about this time the Second War came, and while we were still in our internship we had to join the Army temporarily. We became privates and had to march and do all of that in addition to going to school.
Well, you ended up in Atlanta, and I know as part of your residency.
Well, that was a roundabout way, and I'm rather vague about some of it. I didn't graduate from college, as I say. I graduated, got my degree after my first year in medical school. I got my AB degree, and then I got the MD. And the Army came along. I was very fortunate in the Army, and that while I was in the Army, I was stationed in Atlanta, and there I learned about the Duke orthopedic training program.
Is that when you kind of decided you were going to be an orthopedist?
Well, not really, but
Okay.
I knew that basically what I wanted to do, and somehow along the line, I was fortunate on a rotating residency to be sent to the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital. And I became enamored of children and of children's diseases, and so I knew that that's the direction I wanted to take.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you. You just said something. Why were you enamored? What was it about children and the orthopedic side and children's diseases that you were attracted to? I think that's interesting.
Well, when I was young, my mother volunteered, and she used to pick up children and their parents and take them to clinics to be seen by an orthopedic doctor.
Mm-hmm.
So early in life I got introduced to the fact that there were crippled children, and I saw some of them, and I think that pointed me in the direction that I wanted to take. And then in my residency, I was very fortunate to be sent to the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital to work with Dr. Roberts. And then it was on a rotation internship, and I was down at Warm Springs, Georgia, which was the Polio Institute.
What were you doing? I know at the Orthopedic Hospital in Gastonia, primarily children with, I guess at that time, polio was still really pervasive, and a lot of kids were getting it. same thing at Warm Springs? Was it still a pretty primarily a polio clinic or hospital?
Warm Springs was really founded by Franklin Roosevelt, and he was attracted to the waters down there, and eventually out of that grew the War's Foundation. And when Dr. Baker at Duke was establishing a residency program to train young doctors in orthopedics, I was lucky enough to get on that program. And through that program, I got sent to the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital. And then eventually I was sent to Warm Springs, Georgia.
You told me in our little pre-interview when we spoke a couple of weeks ago that while you were down there, and you were still, a resident, you were a doctor, but you weren't. But you ended up kind of through a series of events, ended up being really running the program. Tell us about that.
That's right. I had to run that program because Dr. Irwin, who was the chief down there, had an automobile accident, and they were unable to locate a person who had his boards, and they had to have somebody to keep seeing patients who came into Warm Springs for evaluation. So for at least 2 years, I don't remember the exact length of time, instead of finishing my rotation for my residency, I stayed at Warm Springs and ran the program down there.
Were you still in your late 20s at that time?
What?
How old were you? In your late 20s?
Early 20s.
Early 20s?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Because you graduated from high school when you were 16, as a matter of fact. So
yeah.
You were a little ahead of the curve.
I was ahead of the van, and it worked out well for me because I was able to work with Dr. Jacobs and eventually with Dr. Oscar Miller and Dr. Winkler and of course Dr. Roberts, and these were some of the real founders of orthopedics.
Here in Gastonia as well as down in Warm Springs.
Dr. Oscar Miller was a children's orthopedist, and he was in Atlanta. They decided to form the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital, and they did in 1921. Dr. Roberts came as the first resident there to the hospital, and then in about 35 or 36, Dr. Baker came to Duke, and Dr. Baker had no real training in children's orthopedics. At that time, the North Carolina Orthopedic Hospital had a clinic in Goldsboro. We had one in, we went Goldsboro. I went down to the coast.
Wilmington?
Wilmington. Yeah, we had a clinic in Wilmington. I had a clinic in Asheville. I had a clinic in,
Sounds like you did a lot of traveling.
Yeah, and we had to see patients in those. At our clinic at the orthopedic hospital, we usually saw 75 to 100 children in an afternoon. When we went to Goldsboro, it was usually about, 75 to 100.
Goodness.
Then in the early days, we'd see maybe 100 down at the coast, something like that. Well, Dr. Baker at Duke decided that he wanted to begin to treat adults, and then he came in to develop a residency program at Duke. And so he hooked up with Dr. Roberts, and they began, eventually, Dr. Goldner, who became chief of orthopedics at Duke, came down to Goldsboro, and he would see the adults there. well, we saw the children,
Which was what you kind of enjoyed doing anyway.
which was the way we wanted it, because it's kind of difficult to have a big clinic with that many people and have both adults and children seen.
Sure. Well, I want to ask you about two more things because we're running out of time. One is your experience at Orthopedic Hospital and what it was like there, treating the kids. Obviously, polio was cured, quote unquote, and so most of the kids that were there were no longer polio patients, but they were orthopedic children patients. And then also I want to talk to you about your wife Judith and how you met, and kind of talk a little bit about, just for a few moments, about that relationship and kind of how it ended in 60 years of marriage.
Well, when I was at Warm Springs, she came down there to learn about treating polio patients. And she left, and she went back to Cleveland, and she worked in Cleveland for a while, and then she decided she wanted to go back to North Carolina. And she came back to North Carolina and got a job where she was working in children's clinics. And I had not seen her in quite some time, and I happened to be in Raleigh, and my mother was there, and for some reason she ended up there. And so after about 4 years, we resumed our acquaintance, and eventually, with a great deal of argument and banter back and forth, after a matter of another 4 years, we decided to get married.
Well, quite a love story.
But she was an outstanding individual, just a delightful person.
Well, I was in your room.
She was a miller.
Oh, she was a miller too.
So
Well,
it was real funny when we got together at family reunions. My mother was still alive, and there'd be my mother, Mrs. Miller, her mother, Mrs. Miller, Miss Miller, Dr. Miller, and then all of the rest.
all the Millers.
It was a great crowd. You know.
Yeah, a lot of confusion
A
reigned.
lot of confusion.
Well, and also I want you, if you could, before we finish, tell me a little bit about your memories about your working at the Orthopedic Hospital. You know, it was known really probably all over the Southeast, if not the nation,
Yes.
as a place
Yeah.
that did incredible work, and you were a huge part of that. You won't say that you were probably, but maybe you will. But I think you were, your name was with Dr. Roberts and Dr. Oscar Miller, pretty much synonymous with what went on at that hospital, where it cared for kids who couldn't afford the care. And so tell me a little bit about your memories of that, and then we'll finish our interview.
Well, I felt very fortunate to be at the Orthopedic Hospital because I was able to work with two outstanding attendants who were not nurses, but they were the equivalent of nurses. They were in our operating room. They were in our clinics. They taught us how to put on plaster in the days when you had to use plaster, and they gave me a great education.
Mm-hmm.
And those two nurses, eventually, they became friends, and after Judy and I got married, they would go to the beach with us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, did you enjoy going to work there every day?
Well, I didn't work there all the days.
I know you had your own clinic.
We
but
had to have our own office because the state wasn't very generous with pay, and we had to have a private practice in order to be able to eat.
Oh, I see.
So we had that private practice, and that's when eventually we developed the Gaston Orthopedic Clinic, which is now the sports medicine.
Well, let me ask you this, because with regard to the children, was it hard not to, or maybe you did, develop a relationship with the kids that were in there in the hospital, or did you try to keep a little bit of a wall?
Oh, listen, when I was a resident, I had a wonderful time. See, I was single, and I could go over to the hospital. I had a room at the back of the hospital, and I could just go down and I could go and play with the kids
Mm-hmm.
and have a good time.
Well, I've had a good time this afternoon. I really appreciate your sharing all this with us. It's been real meaningful for me, and I think that those that listen to it and your family will enjoy hearing a little bit about your early life and also your professional life. And I thank you for being here and being a part of 90 over 90. And I'll see you on the internet, Dr. Miller.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate your asking me.
Yes, sir. Thank you for doing it.